Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to our session on cities building momentum for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. I'm so glad that all of you have joined us today. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and where you're joining us from. We'll be recording the session today. Only the panelists and the screen shares will be included in the recording, none of the chat content, but please do reach out if you don't feel comfortable with the recording. My name is Seble. I am the Global Cities Campaign Lead for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and I'll be moderating the session with all of you today. We are joined today by the first movers in the call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. In this First Movers Club, Vancouver is the first city in the world to endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Barcelona is the first European city to call for the treaty, and Los Angeles is the first city in the US to support the call and the campaign for this treaty. We know that cities are a really essential piece of the climate movement, both on the front line of the climate crisis, facing heat waves and flooding and wildfire smoke that are fundamentally reshaping urban communities, infrastructure, and ecosystems. And the city councilors who join us today know this all too well. Cities are on the forefront of climate solutions as well, taking action to phase out fossil fuels from their jurisdictions and accelerating renewable energy to support a just energy transition from the ground up. The cities that have joined us today, Vancouver, Barcelona, soon to come, and Los Angeles, are part of a growing chorus leading the way and supporting the global call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. Our session today will focus on the critical role that cities can play as part of this global campaign. And our city councilors that have joined us here today can tell you how, alongside climate justice coalitions, they collectively made this happen. I'll introduce you to our incredible panelists, and then I'll give you a short intro on the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty before we hear from all our speakers on the treaty initiative and the role of cities in building momentum for a global fossil fuel phase out and a just energy transition. We'll then open it up to questions before we close. And as a reminder, you can post your questions at any time in the chat window. At the bottom, there's a button that's labeled Q&A, so you can put them there. We have an amazing tech team supporting us today, Gemma and Brenna from the treaty, and they'll make sure that these questions are answered by the panelists. But if we're not able to answer them live, then we'll try to answer them for you in writing. So I want to thank our incredible speakers for being here with us today. Our speakers are Council Member Christine Boyle, who is a first-term Vancouver City Councillor. Elected in 2018, Christine led Vancouver to declare a climate emergency and then to implement one of the most ambitious and comprehensive climate action plans in North America. She has also been successful at getting Vancouver to commit to implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and has been a vocal advocate for strong public services, for expanding co-op and social housing, for harm reduction, and more. Christine is a community organizer, a climate justice activist, and an ordained United Church minister. She previously did national climate organizing among diverse faith communities, including at the Paris Climate Summit and at the Vatican. Council member Eloy Badia is an industrial engineer from the UPC and has been a councillor for the Barcelona City Council since 2015. And since 2019, he's been leading the climate emergency and ecological transition area, in charge of putting forward Barcelona's Climate Emergency Declaration, a document that contains more than 350 city commitments to fight climate change. He has also promoted the implementation of the low emission zone, the largest in Southern Europe, with an area of 95 kilometers squared, to fight pollution, the most significant problem facing Barcelona. In addition, among other objectives, to work so that the city can advance in the energy transition, increase waste recycling, public water management, and improve the naturalization and biodiversity of the city. And last but not least, we have Council Member Paul Koretz, who is finishing his third and final term representing 250,000 people in the 5th District of Los Angeles, a district which includes Bel Air, Westwood, and Encino. Environmentally, he's best known for being the first council member to call for LA to move beyond coal and natural gas power, banning plastic bags, closing down the San Onofre nuclear generating station, establishing efforts to protect biodiversity and wildlife habitat connectivity in a city of 4 million people, co-launching the effort to phase out neighborhood oil drilling in LA, calling for an international fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, and instituting the world's first climate emergency mobilization office. So we're thrilled to have all of you here. Thank you so much for being part of this panel. To start, we're just going to show a very brief 2-minute video as an intro to the treaty. I'll do a little deep dive into it after, and then we'll open up. I'll be moderating questions with our panelists. So Brenna, if you could show the intro video for the audience, that would be great.
The generation that grew up with nuclear weapons were told to hide under their desks in case of attack. This generation faces an even greater threat, the climate crisis. And again, they have nowhere to hide. While citizens, cities, and countries are working to reduce their emissions, behind our backs, the coal, oil, and gas industry continues to rapidly expand fossil fuels, driving catastrophic warming. Surviving the climate crisis requires a bold new idea. Introducing the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Why a treaty? 50 years ago, the world signed a non-proliferation treaty to avoid nuclear war. In 1987, the Montreal Protocol protected the ozone. The Paris Agreement begins to limit emissions, but doesn't mention coal, oil, or gas. We need a global plan to end the proliferation of fossil fuels and fast-track solutions. A fossil fuel treaty would phase out coal, oil, and gas faster, more fairly, and forever, while supporting workers, communities, and countries dependent on fossil fuels. People around the world are already winning frontline battles against coal, oil, and gas projects. A treaty can bring together these diverse efforts into a powerful and equitable global plan. Endorse the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and together we can drive a just transition to clean energy and a safe climate for generations to come.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just share my screen. Okay. So thanks so much for sharing the video, and I hope it was helpful for anyone who hasn't seen it yet. So as I said before, I'm the city's campaigner for the treaty, and we know that we really need bold, urgent, and collective action to address the climate emergency. And fossil fuels are really the largest culprit in the climate emergency because since the Industrial Revolution, coal, oil, and gas have been responsible for around 80% of global carbon emissions. So to stop the climate emergency, we need to stop the expansion of fossil fuels, phase out the reserves that currently exist, and ensure a just energy transition. As part of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, we have a lot of different intersecting objectives. One is really to be changing the global norms around fossil fuels. A lot of the current campaigns are tackling reducing emissions and demand, but we're really trying to start with the supply side actions and supply side policy that stops fossil fuels at source. We understand that this is going to take a massive amount of international cooperation. We're working to provide this missing framework for a multilateral agreement that facilitates a just energy transition. And we want to grow the global support for this movement for climate justice and a just transition. In my role as the city's campaigner, we're working to get cities like the ones who are with us today, cities and states and local governments to endorse the treaty and phase out fossil fuels within their local jurisdictions. We're also developing a global registry on fossil fuels that is working to increase the transparency and accountability to have open access information around fossil fuel production. And we see our movement as one that is complementing really powerful coalitions that are working to stop fossil fuel extraction on their land with frontline communities, or divestment campaigns, or ones to stop financing or fossil fuel subsidies, or to make their politics fossil free. So we're fitting into this kind of coalition of different climate movements. The climate change and the failure to act on climate change has been identified as the greatest threat that is facing humanity in terms of both the likelihood of this threat happening and the impact should it take place. It's even been identified as a higher risk or on par with weapons of mass destruction. So here we see in the production gap this massive disconnect between what is actually the projections of countries in terms of fossil fuel production and what is necessary for a 2-degree or a 1.5-degree pathway. And actually, the current plans for the coming decade overshoot 2 degrees by 50%. We're producing 50% more fossil fuels than would be compatible with a 2-degree pathway, and 120% more than would be compatible with a 1.5-degree pathway. So we know that this status quo will send us on a path of climate chaos, and we really need to stop production at source. Even the International Energy Agency, which is the leading energy forecaster and known as sometimes conservative in its projections, has said in this 1.5 or the net zero scenario that there is no need for investment in new fossil fuel supply in our net zero pathway. So everyone says, yes, but the Paris Agreement, we understand that the Paris Agreement is really important. And it tackles a lot of reducing emissions and demand side, but it actually does not mention coal, oil, or gas at all in the agreement. And it would lead us currently with pledges to around a 3-degree warming by the end of the century. So we see the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty as complementary to the Paris Agreement because it tackles supply side action to stop fossil fuels. Obviously, this is incredibly complex, and the need for international cooperation is vital in making such a treaty possible. This chart is basically showing what is the oil share of government revenues. So we see countries like Canada, the US, the UK have less dependency of their government revenue on oil shares, but they actually have really higher GDPs, whereas countries like Congo or Iraq have a higher dependency on oil shares as part of their revenue and lower GDPs. So countries that are on this upper left quadrant, Norway, the US, Canada, the UK, would really have that responsibility to be funding this transition, not only because of their financial capacity now, but also because of their historic responsibility in contributing to the climate crisis. This is another visualization of this in terms of what is the percentage of the employment that comes from coal mining, and the dependency is on the bottom right, South Africa, China, Poland, whereas countries like Germany and the US have less dependency of coal mining in their employment and much higher capacity. So we're really thinking of this in terms of a just transition and making sure that workers and communities employed in fossil fuel industries are also not left behind it and have new employment streams when this transition is taking place. So the treaty, if you haven't kind of heard the idea yet, is also taking inspiration from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It follows these 3 pillars. The first is non-proliferation, to not add to the problem, so stopping expansion and exploration of new fossil fuel reserves. The global disarmament piece is to phase out existing reserves of fossil fuels in line with a 1.5-degree pathway, and to really ensure a peaceful transition, which is a just energy transition for the treaty. So as I was saying before, there's a lot of different pieces in the climate movement, and we see our role as complementing from this supply side angle of stopping fossil fuel production, not only in different struggles locally, but really making this an international regime that requires international cooperation, cities and countries to sign on. And we have partners in the continents that kind of guide our work on the ground. We have political research and campaigning working groups. So the political the political working group is working to have these first mover countries. The research, we recently had a fossil fuel exit strategy that was put forward, saying not only, as the IEA has also echoed, that do we need to stop fossil fuel expansion, we need to phase out because otherwise we'll overshoot our 1.5-degree pathway. And the wonderful news is we have this massive renewable energy potential globally. So I want to show that it's really gaining momentum. 101 Nobel laureates on the eve of the Biden Climate Summit right before Earth Day endorsed the call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. There's now, I think, 500 different groups globally calling for this treaty. And what I really want to put a spotlight on today is the role that cities are taking. So we're joined today by these first movers in endorsing the treaty at the city level. Vancouver is the first city globally to do so. Barcelona is the first European city, and LA is the first city in the US. So they're really, taking this forward and on the vanguard of this movement, which we're so excited about, and really stress that cities are really powerful and influential voices in changing this narrative, making change even in their local jurisdictions, but also building pressure from the ground up to the national governments. So we have a campaign hub where all of this information is available. If you're interested in starting your own campaigns, please reach out. I'll put my email also in the chat and we'll share these resources. These are different ways that you can get involved, and you can kind of engage with the Fossil Fuel Treaty. Before I finish, I'll stop sharing, but what I did want to say is a brief update on basically how the campaign is going so far at the city level. In addition to the cities that I've said that I've already endorsed, the Australian Capital Territory has endorsed. We have campaigns in Amsterdam, and several other US cities, a couple councils in the UK, 2 councils in Melbourne, Australia. In Amsterdam, city councillors from the Green Party presented the treaty as questions to the Amsterdam City Council, and their intention is to endorse in the 3rd or 4th quarter of 2021. We have climate campaigners in Bonn, Germany, that have done a grassroots action and will formally submit the treaty to their city council this month. New York City, they're considering endorsing the treaty. It was kind of held up by the local elections in the end of June, but we're going to be kind of campaigning again before the general election takes place in November. In Texas, they're with the Texas Campaign for the Environment. They're looking at what is the role of kind of how can we mobilize for fossil fuel phase out in the context of preemption laws. In Santa Fe, Argentina, we presented the treaty to the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, to their provincial government, which will be meeting with their Minister of Environment, and they want to also invite us to speak to the Federal Environment Roundtable. Sudbury, Canada did an action on World Environment Day from Fridays for Future. In Sweden, cities across Sweden, Friends of the Earth Sweden is running a campaign in different Swedish cities to endorse the treaty. Toronto, we want to spotlight because they'll be putting forward a motion to their city council next week on July 14th. In Vienna, we also spoke with city councilors from the Green Party that see fossil fuel phase out as a logical next step in their city, since Austria has a 2040 net zero pathway. And we're engaging and putting a lot more focus on global South cities. And we've done in the past weeks outreach with South Africa and different cities there, in Lagos, in Colombian cities, also with Sierra Leone. And we're engaging with our local partners on the ground in Asia to see any potential campaigns for Asian cities. So the momentum is rolling, and the cities that are here today are the ones who kind of kickstarted all of this. So we're so grateful to all of you. I've seen that Councilmember Badia has joined. We're so excited you're here. So I want to basically start off by asking a question to Councilmember Christine Boyle. I want to all 3 of you ask basically how this even came to be, the origin stories of the treaty in your cities. So in October 2020, Vancouver became the first city in the world to endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, building off important commitments at the city level to drive forward a just energy transition. This is also creating inspiration for other Canadian cities, such as the grassroots campaign for the city of Toronto to endorse the treaty. So can you tell us about the different elements that made this first global city endorsement possible, and takeaways for other cities that are currently campaigning for the treaty?
Absolutely. So happy to get to be part of this conversation and for all the good work the treaty team is doing. I'm joining you all from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations in the province of BC. And as you may or may not have heard, my home province of BC experienced a record-breaking heat wave about a week ago that resulted in more than 700 deaths across the province. And the beautiful little town of Lytton, BC, which saw the hottest temperatures across the province during the heat dome, caught fire, and basically the whole town burned down. So I've been doing climate work for about a decade, and I'm just doing it with a kind of heightened level of emotion and anxiety this week because of the very real deaths of the people around me in this most recent and most local for us climate event. So in the city of Vancouver, climate work has been happening in one way or another since a city council report back in 1989 called Clouds of Change. In many ways, it's in our DNA in Vancouver through many different political stripes of local government. Our biggest challenge in all of that has been actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We've done lots of good things, a lot of good work around waste, greening in a variety of ways, but we haven't reduced our emissions. And so that's what I've been pushing hard to focus on since I was elected in 2018, is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions in line with the science and with a clear lens on equity and justice. So I'll be honest with you, when I brought forward that climate emergency focus on reducing emissions, the big picture goal passed unanimously. The actual detailed pieces of how we get there have been much bigger fights, and I think we'll get to some of those more specifics later. When the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty came to Vancouver, it also passed unanimously across a very politically diverse local council that we have right now. And I think that it passed unanimously in part because the broad goals of climate action are largely shared among Vancouver residents. I also think it might have passed unanimously because councillors on this council have now sat through some pretty difficult fights about actions within our own jurisdiction, and whichever side of those fights they sat on, I think they've seen us struggling to try to do our part on climate, and I think it leads to a feeling that if we're going to do that, if we're going to wrestle through these hard fights, then so should other places. That to make the local decisions we're making even more impactful, we need everyone else, everywhere else, doing everything that they can too. So these supply and demand side actions and fights all taking place at the same time. And that's the kind of one of the key reasons that I think the treaty is so important, is that if we feel like we're the only ones acting, we risk feeling like chumps. We need everyone acting together. And quite frankly, even my colleagues on the other end of the political spectrum in Vancouver seem to understand that. But also it didn't happen easily. It takes, as we know, on everything important, it takes organizing and mobilizing to make it happen. And so in Vancouver, myself and another counselor, we worked closely with networks of student leaders and climate activists on the treaty, as well as every time a new piece of important climate legislation comes forward. And we're constantly doing the groundwork that we need to be doing, connecting with residents across silos and pushing for fairer policies and showing up for other important fights to build solidarity. And I think those pieces are key. The treaty, when it came to Vancouver, was quite a new idea. And so we were both working to explain what it meant, and also building the political power to get a new and kind of unknown thing passed at a very chaotic and split council. And we did that by mobilizing and organizing so that our elected leaders were hearing from residents on climate, and pushing the rest of my council colleagues to create the political space for them to be a bit more courageous, or for them to vote in support without feeling like it took courage, because it was clear that the support from the public was there. So so that's some of how we were able to get it passed in Vancouver, and quite proud to have been able to do so.
Thank you so much. It's really helpful to see kind of what has been the trajectory in other cities, because I feel like it's an amazing learning experience for any other city who's campaigning now, especially because you've said how politically diverse this council was, and it was still able to move forward. And then seeing now, okay, how do we implement so all this becomes possible? So thank you so much. I now want to turn to Council Member Eloy Badia, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Please correct me if I'm not. So kicking off this year, Barcelona became the first European city to endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and now campaigns across Europe from Amsterdam to Bonn to Vienna to cities across Sweden have taken root. So I wanted to ask, how did this campaign come to be in Barcelona, and what were the critical factors that made the endorsement happen?
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for invitation and for organizing the meeting. I will try to use my best English, but not always is perfect. So I will work on that. And for me, one of the key factors to succeed with this declaration, with this challenge, is the fights that happen before this declaration. No, and sometimes there are some fights that happens a long time ago, very years ago, but this fight that happened very far away is useful for this kind of declaration. I want to start because for me, I selected 3 moments that in Spain or in Barcelona, we have a big awareness about which is the danger of the industrial fuel. No? The first of all is 20 years ago. Maybe you know, but the Prestige is a tanker that sank off at the Galician coast, causing an oil spill that generates one of the biggest ecological disasters of the history of Spain. And it was very shocked of the civil society, because there are volunteers from around all the Spain or from the south of Europe that goes to Galicia to help to recover the beaches. No? And it's happened far away, more or less 20 years ago, but there is a lot of people that knows people that go there or that go there in that moment. And when now we talk about which is the future of Barcelona in terms of energy, a lot of people are connected with this disaster and understand the danger of something like that in Prestige. And every year we see in the news some disasters like that. No? On the other hand, another movement that it was more close, it happens in different regions of Catalonia, is close to the fracking. No? Appear 9 years ago, different projects to try to find a possibility to make investment on fracking. And it was a big movement, very transversal, not only civil society, not only ecologist institutions or entities, not only people from the fathers and mothers from the school. A lot of mayors said, we don't want fracking in my municipality. No, we are talking that we are trying to find fracking in natural resources in a very rural areas. And there is a very extended movement around Spain, but here in Catalonia, we have several areas like La Garrocha, El Ripollès, Osona, La Sagarra, different regions that appear these projects, and there are a lot of opposition at all levels. No? And finally, in 5 years ago, in the parliament of the Catalonian region, there is a formal declaration against fracking to say we don't want this kind of industry in our region. No? And the third project that I have that have very impact on the people is a project that is called Castor. The project Castor is to use a cave of a petroleum that we have in the coast, in the middle of the sea, to use this cave to put gas, and to use this cave as a box to put gas, and then use for the pipelines and other ones. No, when they start this project, it happens 8 years ago. There are some earthquakes related with this project. No, and in the south of Catalonia, in the sea, appears several earthquakes that arrive to the coast, arrive to the village that are in the southern Catalonia and in the north in Valencia, and there is a strong movement that see the danger for environment and for the people. This kind of project that tries to use the cave of an old petroleum station to put gas. No, and this is a strong answer from all the parts of the civil society, and I think that it's formed part of our life. We live with these different conflicts, and we understand very well which are the danger of this kind of industries. And on the other hand, we have the challenge of climate change, of course, no? And we know that Fridays for Future, the young people makes a big demonstration, and we are talking every day that we need to decarbonization of the economy. No, we are a big challenge for 2050, but we have a strong challenge for 2030. No, I think that it's the factor that helps, that when we introduce this treatment, no, this treaty at the City Council of Barcelona, it was relative easy to find people that say, okay, we understand that we need another project for Barcelona and another project for Spain. No? And I think that these fights and the awareness on climate change was crucial to understand that we need to go to another direction and not in that way. So for us, it's relative, not very easy, but so easy, because I think that there are a lot of people that have been fighting very hard from last 20 years at most.
Thank you so much. This is incredibly insightful. And I think exactly what you're alluding to. It was relatively easy, as you say, only because these completely not easy things had been happening for the past couple decades of oil spills and fracking and all these things and pipelines. So I think that community mobilization, this very recent history of ecological damage, kind of made this the obvious next step. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I now want to turn to LA. So Council Member Paul Koretz, I wanted to ask you, Los Angeles has made bold moves by becoming the first city in the US to endorse the call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. And treaty endorsements are now being introduced and passed in cities across the country. So how is this possible in a mega city such as Los Angeles? And what were the key pieces that made this campaign successful? Oh, you're still on mute.
I guess I've demonstrated I'm not the most technical person on this call,
No,
and will remain that. Thank you for including me in this conversation. I greatly appreciate it. And I also want to recognize that I am in unceded land of the Tongva tribe. I think I recognize a good idea the moment I hear it. And I think, of course, that's exactly what we should be doing. And that's how it was with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. I do want to give a shout out to the husband of our esteemed panelist from Vancouver. Seth Klein reached out to my staff with the idea, and I said, hell yes, and off we went. I can't really speak for other municipalities, but in Los Angeles, we're already working to rid ourselves of fossil fuel infrastructure. We're actively working to end oil drilling in our neighborhoods and across the city by declaring it a non-conforming land use and phasing it out through an amortization process. That's at least the legislative direction in which we're headed, but we have not completed that yet. In 2016, we also experienced what's been called the worst human-caused greenhouse gas disaster in history, when the SoCal gas storage facility at Aliso Canyon erupted for 112 days and vented millions of pounds of natural gas / methane into the atmosphere and effectively negated all the climate emissions reductions gains for the whole state of California. And so we're looking hard at how to decarbonize and degas our buildings, and supporting a treaty to end the building of fossil fuel infrastructure seemed like a natural complementary step. And my council colleagues agreed with a unanimous vote of support. We're not the most diverse council politically. We do have one Republican who is an LA Republican, meaning he would make a moderate Democrat anywhere else in the country. I think the fact that the Aliso Canyon disaster occurred in his district probably helped influence him to support this also without much of a second thought. Now, it might have been different if we were voting to end all fossil fuel infrastructure in LA itself. Probably it would have been. It's always politically a little easier to tell someone else to do what you need to do than to do it yourself. The backstory to this is a few years ago, working with one of our terrific local environmental justice groups, Physicians for Social Responsibility, I had introduced a resolution to support the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons and got it approved by the council. A number of cities followed suit, the United Nations, supported by the cities, put the treaty into force. And then ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, ended up winning the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize and bringing it by my office for pictures and to say thank you. So we thought the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty should follow the exact same route. So basically, I'll expect you all to bring another Nobel Peace Prize by my office in the next year or two. I want to add another quick story about why it's been important for Los Angeles to take these steps. California's found itself in a climate leadership position, and so is Los Angeles, which is sometimes considered to be the most watched and influential city in the world. So around the same time a few years ago, with the help of the Leap LA Coalition, I introduced legislation to create the first climate emergency mobilization office we believe in the world. The city of Berkeley, near San Francisco, saw what we were doing and declared a climate emergency, followed by a number of the other cities around the Bay Area, and then London, England, and then New York City, and the effort exploded around the world. Now, I certainly don't want to over-exaggerate the importance of LA's influence, but before we took that step, only 3 municipalities had declared climate emergencies. Since then, nearly 2,000 cities around the world have joined us. We're very much hoping the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty effort is able to follow that path.
Thank you so much, and we hope so as well, that it balloons and grows to the thousands. Yeah, and I think it's hard to hear that so much of the reasons why these were compelling next steps in your cities is because there's already been so much climate disaster. But I think it really stresses kind of what the urgency is and how much we need to take this collective action now. So thank you to all 3 of you for sharing the origin stories of the treaty in your cities. I wanted to circle back to Councilmember Christine Boyle. So Vancouver has developed a greenest city in the world action plan and a climate emergency response plan. I wanted to ask if you can speak to local examples in Vancouver's push to phase out fossil fuels and herald a just transition, and the role of cities, including urban civil society, in creating normative change on the climate crisis.
Yeah, I'm always happy to talk about all of those pieces. So, as I said before, kind of green efforts have long been a priority in Vancouver, really, though with varying levels of ambition and varying levels of equity. But our biggest challenge has been actually reducing our carbon pollution. And I would say another challenge has been that often these greening efforts have been seen by residents, sometimes correctly and sometimes not, as simply making land more valuable and enriching property owners, pushing the cost of housing further and further out of reach for working people. So when Vancouver declared a climate emergency, we committed to acting in line with the science, with a real focus on equity, and that continues to be a big push of mine. It's been, our staff have really embraced that, that lens and that work, but also it's been a shift for a bunch of them because we're used to having these conversations in different departments, you know. So that continues to be a growing edge for us, and the community pushing on it makes a big difference too. Our big climate emergency action plan had 6 big moves. It had more than 50 accelerated actions. There were things we were already tinkering away at, but not nearly at the speed and urgency needed. And the big focus of the plan has been on buildings and transportation. So as we heard out of Barcelona, the fight here too, a big part of the fight here is around fracked gas and natural gas. And so in the city of Vancouver, our electric grid is relatively clean. It's mostly hydro. If we can electrify at the same time as increasing efficiency. We reduce the emissions, particularly in our buildings, in a really significant way. And the reality is, as we have seen a number of times when we've tried to take those steps in Vancouver, is that the natural gas industry and its sort of lobby groups and counterparts push back very aggressively against those fights. So a big piece of our climate plan has been getting gas out of new buildings, requiring electric heating and hot water in new buildings, large multifamily, as well as new low density buildings. And then looking at how we retrofit existing buildings to get off gas with a mixture of, we have in BC for a while been using a carrot approach. We have had incentives to get the gas out and fuel switch, and we're moving into, I would say we're long past time when we need a stick approach as well. And so we're setting some pretty strict requirements and then providing financial incentives as well to make it viable for people, but moving to mandatory past just encouraging. The one piece I would highlight on the retrofit piece that we're really still taking a bit more time on to make sure we do well is looking at how we retrofit existing rental housing to make sure that the retrofit, the energy retrofit of rental housing doesn't lead to further displacement of renters. And so we need to be thoughtful about how we implement those regulations at the same time as strengthening our tenant protection rules to make sure that, the tenants aren't kicked out and rents aren't jacked up just because of the greening, which really gets to that early piece. We need to make sure that the climate work we're doing isn't further punishing folks who are already struggling the most in the city. So all of that is on the building side. The transportation side is also about getting off gas, and to some degree that's about incentivizing the switch to electric vehicles and putting in the infrastructure that makes that possible. But as we all know, even more so, it's about increasing the speed and accessibility and reliability of public transit and allowing more and more people to make the switch from relying on their own vehicle to taking public transit or active transportation, and making it less deadly to be a pedestrian or a cyclist in the city. And then the last thing I'm just going to tag on here is that this most recent climate plan is the first time that Vancouver has looked at land use as a climate issue, which sort of blows my mind that those were always separate. The housing file and land use in particular wasn't part of our climate action, but the reality is that a lot of the emissions in the region come from working people having been pushed out of the city and having to make long commutes to get into their communities, being in communities that are not designed to live in well without a car. So we're really starting to look at how we design our communities and how we regulate our land use in a way that supports low emission, lowering emissions in every way. And again, that is like a whole nother sort of challenging cultural fight, because talking about ending exclusionary zoning and talking about legalizing rental in some of our most exclusive neighborhoods is a big political challenge, and it's I think another fundamental one for cities in tackling the climate emergency. So we're working on bringing all those things together and sort of picking all the battles at once, because we have run out of time to not do that.
Thank you so much. I think it's really important how much you've stressed how intersecting all of these issues are, and how when focusing on the climate emergency, for example, in the case of Vancouver, housing is a critical part of that, and affordability and mobility justice. So I think, yeah, it's integral that equity and justice is at the center of all these actions that we're taking to address the climate crisis. Thank you so much. Now I wanted to turn to Council Member Eloy Badia. Spain's new climate law bans all new coal, oil, and gas exploration and production permits and promises to stop all fossil fuel production by 2042. So I wanted to ask, how does this translate to the local level, and what concrete actions is the city of Barcelona taking to phase out fossil fuels and ensure a just energy transition?
Okay, I think that, like, similar to Vancouver, the document, I think that explains better which is the answer, no, to this kind of commitment, is the declaration of climate emergency. We make it in January of 2020. We have been working in a process of 6 months, and there are hundreds of initiatives. I will talk only some of ones, maybe the most interesting or more important. And more, we work on mobility, on energy, and waste, and food. The two best are where we have more emissions, on mobility and energy. And on mobility, one of the big issues that we start in the same day that we make the declaration is a low emission zone. A low emission zone is that is not allowed that the cars that are more polluted, normally the old cars, that the most polluted cars and the cars that make more emissions of the gases of climate change, are not permitted to drive around the city during the day, no? And it wasn't a strong measure, because in just only 1 year, more or less disappear 500,000 of trips of the cars that are more polluted. So it's a strong change. We think that we change more or less 30% of the cars that are moving around the city. But it's true that it's not enough, because the majority of the people change the car. They go to another car that maybe it's more efficiency, but at the same time we reduce the carbon emissions, and we reduce the air pollution. So it was important, because as I say, more or less 500,000 of the trips per day disappear. The half more polluted disappear with this kind of measure. And on the same time, we want to reduce the private mobility, the private cars. The goal is to arrive on a 25% of reduction. And we have three clear actions, no? To promote the public transport, to promote the bicycle. We are building more than 200 kilometers for roads for bicycles in the city, and walking, because Barcelona is a very friendly city to walk. You can go walking around. So we have a lot of people that the main transport that they use is the feet. So we have to promote that we can walk around the city. And this is the idea, to reduce 25% of the private mobility, no? On the second topic, we have the same problem like Vancouver with the buildings. We have buildings that are not efficiency. We use a lot of gas for the heating. So we are making different projects to promote that we change and we go to the efficiency on the buildings, and we make a rehabilitation on energy. On the other hand, we have to promote that we don't have a space, but we have a lot of roof, so we can put photovoltaic panels, we can put energy panels in the roof, and we are trying to promote a revolution of the roof, we call, and because we need to produce on the roof. And we are in some experimental projects to produce energy from the solar on the pavements, on the streets. We are focused on new technologies that helps us to use the streets with the panels on the streets, that you can walk around, but at the same time they produce energy for the lights or for forever, no? So we are trying to think more, and we can be the future of the energy, no? On the waste, we are to increase the recycling, but we have some strategic initiatives for the plastics. We are focused on the single-use plastics, to say that we don't want a single-use plastics on the city. We know that plastic is another problem that comes from the fuel, no? It comes from the petroleum. So we are promoting not to use plastic on the city, and specifically for single-use plastics, no? And the last one, and it was close to the petroleum, because the food sometimes comes from far away, no? We know that sometimes the food that we are eating, it's 1,000 or 2,000 kilometers far away. So we are trying to promote the local the local farmers, to promote in the schools, in the hospital, a diet that is come from the locals and is ecological, try to reduce the use of consumption of petrol, and if it's close, it's more ecological, it's cheaper, and we are promoting another kind of farming that we need in Spain and we need in Barcelona.
Thank you so much. And it's encouraging to see all these actions that are taking place in a wide variety of different sectors that you mentioned, and also kind of the experiences that you share between these 3 different cities. And I saw that Laxmi, you had your hand up. If you could just put your question in the Q&A, we can get to it right after this next question I'm going to ask. So I wanted to turn to Council Member Paul Koretz. Los Angeles, as you mentioned, created the world's first climate emergency mobilization office and has done important work to restrict the supply of fossil fuels. Different examples are passing a citywide phase out of oil and gas drilling and banning the construction of new gas stations. So I wanted to ask you, how do these connect with actions to protect frontline communities and ensure environmental justice for those that are most impacted by fossil fuel extraction, especially in the context of LA that has this massive diversity of both people and neighborhoods? Oh, you're on mute again. It's okay.
And I said something so brilliant and you didn't even hear it. Working with the LEAP LA Coalition, we designed the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office to be centered on environmental justice. Too many times in the past, climate policy has had negative impacts on frontline communities. So with the Climate Emergency Office, we wanted to put Indigenous people and frontline communities and labor communities in leadership positions on our Climate Emergency Commission, to actually vet our climate policies before we approve them, to make sure that as we make the greatest transition the city has ever seen, that everybody wins. As a for instance, when we started to address concerns about oil drilling in Los Angeles, one of my colleagues and I introduced legislation to ban fracking. Then we heard from environmental justice friends that banning fracking wouldn't even begin to fix the real problems going around the city, the toxic exposures to oil rigs right next door to residents, creating nosebleeds and cancer for adjacent neighbors. So we shifted and we aimed instead to put a 2,500-foot buffer zone around oil drilling. And finally, we realized that the simplest way to protect frontline communities is simply to declare oil drilling a non-conforming land use and to start phasing it out. Of course, we wanted to do it in such a way that creates a just transition for fossil fuel workers, which we think is paramount to that effort. And I do want to add, as we address oil and gas infrastructure, we also need to look at the demand side of the issue. As long as people continue to use gasoline, the fossil fuel companies will find a way to provide it. If they aren't poisoning people in LA, they'll do it in Ecuador and ship it here. So I think it's critical to look at that side. So the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, has said he will phase out the sale of gas-powered vehicles by 2035, which is a good step in the right direction. But a gas vehicle purchased in 2034 could last until 2055 or longer, which is climate insane to still have gas producing vehicles on the road in 2055. The state of Washington has passed legislation to ban the sale of gas cars by 2030, which is closer to what we need. But I believe we need to do it as soon as possible. If you have cancer, you stop smoking. If your planet is overheating, you stop pouring gasoline on it. So we need to aim for 2025 at the latest. And tomorrow, honestly, wouldn't be too soon. We also need to go after plastic pollution and single-use items in a big way. The fossil fuel industry, seeing the writing on the wall, is shifting resources towards plastic production. They have allocated $180 billion towards new plastic production facilities in the near term. We're going after plastics in LA, so we can stop the pollution in our neighborhoods, in our oceans, and the greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere. Also, just as an aside, because it's not really exactly on point relating to petroleum, we're also reducing greenhouse gases by working at better disposal of our organics, our foodstuffs. So we have a new program working with commercial waste haulers where they will either use anaerobic digesters or composting and take all of the organic food waste that we are able to get to them and dispose of it in such a way that methane is dramatically reduced and some good high value fertilizer is produced, and it winds up in some cases actually drawing down the amount of pollution rather than massively increasing it. So just a few thoughts on things we're working on.
Thank you so much. And I think those all have massive potential. I mean, even these city composting schemes were diverting what is creating a massive amount of methane, which is even more potent than carbon emissions, and now growing that for soil to make good food. And also exactly what you said, how the fossil fuel industry is looking to extend its lifeline through pushing all these single-use plastics. So I think it's good to see the different actions that are taking place in all of your cities. We've run over time, so we're gonna just take one question from the Fossil Free Politics campaign, whoever wants to take it as speedy as we can. And then we'll unfortunately have to wrap up. So this question is from the Fossil Free Politics campaign in Europe. And it says, moving away from fossil fuels means challenging really powerful vested interests who don't actually want to see this transition happen. So how can we protect decision-making from the fossil fuel industry in the same way that we protect public health decision makers from the tobacco lobby? And how can civil society groups work to influence cities to take action on supporting clean energy and phasing out fossil fuels? So I'm not sure who would like to take this on, but we do have to keep it brief. And if you have any examples, feel free to share.
I guess I could answer that question. I think it couldn't be more important or more urgent for NGOs and community groups and student groups everywhere to engage with their elected officials on a very regular, even weekly basis as these policies move forward. Lobbyists meet with elected officials with such frequency that they almost feel like friends. So it might be the coalitions working to end fossil fuel infrastructure that needs to establish those relationships and make those regular contacts. We're fighting the most rich and powerful industry in the world. And we can't expect it to go down quietly. They're putting labor organizations in our way, certainly in the US, I imagine around the world. And those are folks that we're used to working closely with and being arm in arm with. But we need to figure out other ways to keep those folks well employed. So like President Biden's infrastructure bill, I know we can do it working together. Relentlessly for the future of our planet. And I would ask all of you in every corner of the world to be doing that with your elected officials.
Thank you so much. I don't know if either of you wanted to add anything about that. Otherwise, I'll just wrap up the event. Yeah, go ahead.
I would just say the piece I think about a lot is that organized people beat organized money, and that needs to be our approach on every front, that these industries will lobby hard and they have the pocketbooks to do it, but we have people showing up and fighting every piece of this fight on accountability in government, on transparency, on transition, on workers' rights, and that's the only way that we beat the pocketbooks that they have.
Thank you so much. Yes, go ahead.
Just for I think that we have to legislate very concrete obligations for all the, not only for the people, for the big companies too, no? And because now we are seeing in Europe that there are beginning some sentences of the courts that defends the Agreement of Paris and defends that we need a more ambitious climate change laws. We see in Netherlands, or we see in other countries, that the courts start to make some sentence to defend the environment. No? So legislation is very important. And I think that we have another ally on this fight, because they are so powerful. That is the science. We have to work with the scientists, and we have to give the voice to the scientists on the front page, no? And with the civil society, with the scientists, with the legislation, I think that we have to be stronger.
Thank you all so much. This is really helpful for all that we're up against and continuing momentum. I wanted to thank each of our panelists, Councilmember Christine Boyle, Councilmember Paul Koretz, Councilmember Eloy Badia. We thank you so much for sharing all of your insights and experience from your cities leading on the treaty. And a big thank you to our tech support leads, Gemma and Brenna, and to the Fearless Cities team for putting this together. They'll be sharing different ways to get involved, which are to endorse the treaty as an organization or as an individual at fossilfueltreaty.org. If you're interested in leading a campaign targeting a city and calling on them to endorse the Fossil Fuel Treaty, you can contact me. My first name is in my Zoom name, Seble at fossilfueltreaty.org for support. There's the Treaty Campaign Hub at campaign.fossilfueltreaty.org, and you can look at the different resources that have a pitch to cities, a draft treaty endorsement motion, and a support guide on how to influence city governments. So I want to thank all of you so much for participating in this session, and we look forward to staying connected with you and encourage you to check out other events that are part of Fearless Cities. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for participating.
Thank you very much. It was very inspiring.
Thank you for us too.